The majority of people today know very little about these 8 ancestors, even though they are the root of all modern religions and the source of all. So we can look at the Temple Mount, considered one of the holiest places in the world, but very few people are aware of the fact that underneath of the so-called holy Jewish temple, there's an Egyptian temple that still stands underneath the abomination built by the Jews. And I've showed you guys this map before of the territory that belonged to the Egyptians during the time of Tutankhamun, and it includes Israel and all of the Middle East. So the foundation on which the Jewish temple was built is Egyptian. Just like the temple in Israel, the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have their beginnings in Egypt. And all of the Abrahamic religions are just branches of one tree, which stems from one root. So let's return to the root of the tree before the Abrahamic religions formed. And the sources of knowledge that form the Abrahamic religions come from things like the myth of Osiris from Egypt, the Popol Vuh of the Mayans from South America, and the Sumerian flood tablets found in the Middle East, along with what the Egyptians recorded about the separation of land after the flood. So I'm going to explain the 8 ancestors on the boat of Ra. So the story of Noah's flood, told in the Abrahamic religions, speaks of 8 people surviving the flood and repopulating the earth. But the root of this story is based on the 8 people that are seen in the boat of Ra. And while much of the information of these 8 ancestors has been largely distorted and categorized as myths or legends or alien gods, the reality is the Egyptians themselves recorded that these 8 people were all real, living people that were alive during and after the flood. And not only that, but they were the founders of the First Dynasty of Egypt and the Mayan civilization after the flood. So I showed you guys in part 4 of the Mayans were Egyptians. Roughly 5,000 years ago, the First Dynasty of Egypt was formed. And this, of course, wasn't the first dynasty ever, because the Egyptian kingship goes back 39,000 years, but it was the first kingship in Egypt after the devastation of the flood. So the First Dynasty had 2 rulers, Djur and Djet. But before Djur and Djet were set up as the 2 principal rulers of the First Dynasty, Namur was the principal ruler of Egypt during the time of the flood before Djur and Djet. And you'll notice that Djur and Namur look alike. It's because Namur is Djur's father. Namur is also known as the Scorpion King, and some scholars have even said that Namur and Djur were the same people. But this was later proven to be false because the Egyptians left behind records showing that Namur and Djur were indeed 2 separate people, and they were father and son. So this is a rock glyph dating to 3100 BC during the time of the flood, and it's called the Nag el-Hamdulab carvings. So these rock glyphs belong to Namur, and they actually predate the Namur palette that many people are familiar with. And these rock glyphs show a boat journey and a procession of several boats filled with all types of animals, just like the story of Noah's flood. And it's important to know that these rock glyphs are the oldest known artifacts of an Egyptian king known to exist anywhere, and they date to the time of the flood. And some scholars have even connected the biblical Misraim, Noah's grandson, to Menes, who is actually Djur. And remember I said Djur is Namur's son. So even some scholars have been smart enough to connect the biblical story of Noah's flood to Namur and his son Djur. And Namur is the original Osiris from the story of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set. And this brings me to Namur, or Osiris's wife, Niahotep, also known as Isis. And Niahotep was the wife of Namur, the original Osiris. and also the mother of Djer, who was one of the first two rulers of the First Dynasty of Egypt after the flood. So Niahotep lived during the final phase of the pre-dynastic period of Egypt with her husband Namur, also known as Osiris. And she is the mother of Djer, and it's well documented that Niahotep's attributes and magical powers were given to the goddess that we now know as Isis. But before the name Isis was used, there was the name Niahotep. She is the original Virgin Mother before the Jesus, Mary, and Joseph of the Bible, and she gave birth to Horus after the death of her husband Osiris. And it was Niahotep, not Isis, who settled the dispute between Horus and Set. It was she who declared that her son Horus would be king of Egypt, and that her brother Set would be king of the land beyond Egypt's borders. This is why the Popol Vuh of the Mayans tells the same story of Osiris. Keep in mind, at this time, Egypt and all of Asia and Europe were connected, and they were all part of Egypt's empire. And this was all part of the land given to Horus. So what was outside of that was North and South America, the islands, and Canada. This was called the wildlands. And this is why we find H-block structures in Kush and also in South America dating to the time of the flood, which is the very same time that the Egyptians recorded the separation of the land. And this division of the two lands, as scholars like to call it, was literal, because before the flood, South America and Africa were connected. And it was Niahotep, the mother of Horus and wife of Osiris, that divided the land between Horus, who is Djer, and Set, who is Djet. And these are the first two principal rulers of the First Dynasty of Egypt after the flood. In fact, for those who are paying attention to the series of the Mayans were Egyptians, the real name of Niahotep is not Isis, nor is it Niahotep, but her Egyptian name is Weret. Nevertheless, Weret, or Niahotep, is the original Isis from the story of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set. So now that I've explained Osiris and Isis, now let's move on to their son Horus, who is Djer. So we read that Horus Aha, who also used the name Menes, succeeded his father Namur and founded the First Dynasty of Egypt. And he established the capital of Memphis. And Horus Aha, also known as Menes, his throne name is Djer. His father was Namur, also known as Osiris. His mother was Weret, or Niahotep, also known as Isis. And he was the original Horus, born of the Virgin Mother Niahotep after her husband Osiris was killed by his brother Set. So the Egyptian Djer, or Horus, later became known in the Abrahamic religions as Jesus. And what's known as the Passion Play, or the Passion of Christ play, is something that originated in Egypt. And the ancient Egyptians would migrate every year to a sacred site where they would perform what the Greeks later called the Passion Play. But the play performed by the Egyptians was originally a reenactment of the story of Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set. These three ancestors later became known in Christianity as the Holy Trinity, with Jesus born of his Virgin Mother, and according to the Bible, God himself is the father of Jesus, which in the original version of the story would have been Osiris. So I've explained three of the ancestors on the boat of Ra. I'll continue explaining the rest of them in part 2.